So your work is on the eve of the 150th anniversary of John Wesley Powell's famed expedition through the Grand Canyon. I know for this book, you had a very different research technique, probably different, quite different from your past biographies. You actually went down the entire Grand Canyon of the Colorado just to see what Powell experienced. Could you share with us some of that?
Absolutely, Jeremy. You know, a couple of his biographers, wonderful writers, never went down the river, and I feel that was such a kind of a integral part of who Powell was and what he became, for a couple of reasons I'll tell you. So we did 15 days down the river, and we had a dory, so we got wet, and you know, certainly nothing like Powell did on that trip, but to viscerally feel from Lee's Ferry when the Kaibab limestone is at your elbows, 250 million year old Triassic, you know, when the T-Rex were wandering the earth, and then to go down into the earth, you feel as though you're really penetrating Earth's history, and you get down to the basement foundation rocks, and nearly 2 billion years old. And it's so exciting to see. And you look up in that Kaibab limestone that you started out with is, you know, more than a mile above your head, and you get a sense that Powell, who was a geologist, the first to go down the river, what an extraordinary intellectual experience it was. Meanwhile, of course, they're fighting for their lives with one of the most incredible adventure stories in American history. I mean, you know.
And I know you researched a number of archival material and letters, journals. Was there a moment in your journey through the Grand Canyon that you connected with a particular journal entry or Powell's narrative, and you could just get a sense of the hardship, the exposure to the elements that they were encountering back in 1869?
Yeah, you know, that's, you know, certainly the path of the river has not changed, even though it's dam release now, so it's cold water coming from the bottom of the dams going through. And they were, of course, in hot with, you know, with warmer water. But you know, when you're sitting up in front of lava falls and you're looking down and seeing this ferocious water, you can't see a course through it, and we went up and we looked at it. I was just imagining what these guys, who had never seen anything like this before, no one had ever seen this water before, and at this point, of course, their boats are falling apart, their backs are wrenched, their clothes have rotted away, and they're down to just a few pounds of flour. So they're hungry, and they're looking at that. So when you're hearing some of these, you know, I'm hearing these journal, you read, you know, of course, all the journals that were done on the river and done later in tranquility, and they're beginning just to kind of, they play in the back of your head, you know, and of course, you're well fed going down the river, and people have done it before, and you've got these wonderful guides, but you really just get a sense of, in there, turned off from everything. Of course, it was our electronics. There was no opportunity for Powell or any of his men to get out safely or to do or communicate at all. So you imagine how hairy it was, not knowing what is around, and you hear a big roar and what is around each corner. So we would come around a corner and hear some big roar, and you'd go, wow, how big is that? Is this something that we have to stop? Can we run? So yeah.
And of course, your boat was probably a little better suited for running the rapids of the Grand Canyon than the boats Powell and his crew used.
Yeah, striking that. So Powell decided, of course, there really wasn't there was no science of running whitewater. Not much was known. So he picked whitehole boats, which were rowboats that were tracked very well, i.e., they cut through waves very well. Out in New York Harbor, they were used by the New York police, and they were out in the Great Lakes. They were used, and they were used to transport people and supplies to boats waiting out in the harbor and stuff like that. And so Powell thought, oh, that seems like that would work pretty well. Of course, whitewater are not waves, in a bay or in the ocean. They have entirely different dynamics. So he did decide that, to put waterproof bulkheads and to reinforce the beams and all that, but they were pretty disastrous choices, all told, because they couldn't move. They couldn't pivot. And of course, the natural rowing motion is to, row with your back downstream, of course, and they rowed with their backs downstream. But now it always surprises me reading history on how things we take for granted, like that one should face down river looking at the rapids so you can move, as everybody does today, doesn't occur to people. And it didn't occur to them. And it didn't occur to them right at the bat that they needed to have a stern oar, a rudder,
right.
And I think this is of some controversy, but I think that they did figure that out by the middle of the trip. And certainly by their second trip.
So on the second trip, they certainly made some changes to the boats.
Yeah. And the boats, interestingly enough, the one saving grace of it was that the water filled the boats, and it actually made it so a lot of rapids they went through, their boats were filled with water, and it actually made them more steady. Not a fun way to go through.
And I have to ask this question. Did you ever, during your trip through the Grand Canyon, just decide to turn around in the boat and float any stretch backwards, just to get a sense of what that
must have been like? No, I didn't, but I did a lot of rowing, and I can tell you that that it's hard work too, and with the sun and with the rains and with the and then the meager, we were going down in my son, we were right before we were going through Granite Rapids, and my son was 25 and 200 pounds, all muscle, and he leaned out over too much, and a wave took him. I just never forget this feeling. He went out, I could just see this flash of his orange life vest just go whoosh, and he was gone, in a half second. None of these guys, except for Powell, wore, life vest. Wow. And, the life vest he wore was pretty rudimentary, and he only had one arm, so he needed that help. But these guys, they got in the water, and it was, I don't even know how well they could swim, so.
Yeah, it's amazing that no one died.
It's amazing.
From drowning on this accident.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because everybody who tried it before, and for many years after, it wasn't replicated again. So, interesting the choice Powell took on who he went down the river with. And these guys were a bunch of mountain men, irascible, tough guys, he didn't put up with any BS from people. And that was a saving grace, but it also caused some problems in the trip among the guys. But one has to imagine, and I've done a first run of a river, there is a great, but of course we had satellite pictures and all that, and this terrible uncertainty can really gnaw at you about what's next, and it can really fray relationships with it. So I think I shared in the book a little bit of what that's like. And so you get somebody like Powell, and he was used to running a artillery battery, during the Civil War. And he was a no-nonsense kind of guy, telling you what you needed to do. And, and I believe that really was one of the great parts which got them through it. Certainly caused a lot of tension, though.
Yeah, I imagine.
Yeah.
I imagine. I have not floated the Grand Canyon, but I floated the San Juan River with a group of students, and tensions were pretty high at times.
Absolutely.
So the other aspect of it is just how things can change so quickly. We were caught in a snowstorm.
Oh boy.
And a windstorm, and a number of students were starting to become hypothermic, and it's just amazing in that country how things can change so quickly
and go downhill so fast.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you indicate in the book here there were a number of cases where that happened to Powell and his men, kind of the unexpected outside of the river.
Oh boy, Jerry, there's one case it's crazy to read about this. You're thinking about this guy's going down. Well, they stop in front of a rapid. They're going to check out the rapid. It's a bad enough rapid that they need to scout it, but it's noontime, they're going to have some coffee and maybe a little bit to eat. So they pull over. It's a narrow beach, like a lot of them were, up against cliffs. And Powell goes up geologizing to look at rocks, climbs up and looks down, and the cook has, started a little fire, put some coffee on, and the wind comes, as the wind can do, come roaring down, right? Well, there's firewood, there's driftwood, dry branches and bushes and everything like that. Well, a ember catches fire. Everything on fire, and it goes up just like this, conflagration. These guys are in shape, and these guys are paying attention. They're caught flat-footed. Their clothes are on fire, right? It burns the painters that are the bow lines that are for the boats, and they go tumbling into the boats, spinning around backwards. Their clothes still on fire, going down this rapids this way and that way. Powell looks over the cliff that he, and was wondering why everybody is running, why everything, it's terrible. So they get down to the bottom somehow, at the bottom of the rapid. One guy has his eyebrows and his beard singed off. He looks like a ghost. So of course, what do these guys do? They just start laughing. They have burned holes in their pants, what's left of them. But it's kind of I like that anecdote because it's a little bit of a insight into who these guys were, that they just laughed and that was just, and then they moved on to the next thing.
Yeah, and there's been some interesting studies of humor in the American West, and that's a classic example of
just,
going from one extreme, from being drenched to burning yourself, and then being able to laugh
about it, and move forward, absolutely. And so they did pretty much whatever they had to do to survive. And it was just a litany of wrenched backs and sunburn and cracked fingers, and carrying the boats around these and their shoes and their boots started wearing out with the water, their seams, as they started sewing some moccasins, but their clothes started falling off. They all lost their hats. They're down to sharing a blanket, and then it got cold too. It was awful, so they weren't sleeping very well. So you think about people going down something, but then you start imagining the details of it. And then, but then while this was going on, one can imagine, and I talk about this in the book, Powell, who's a geologist, right? The real thing he wanted to go do was not glory hounding to go through this river and kind of become a great American hero, though that's what he became. But he was a geologist and he was a scientist. And this gash in the earth provided one of the most incredible opportunities to see the history of the earth. I mean, everybody was interested in what this was going to, all these geologists. And this was such an exciting time in geology, opening up new avenues of interest in things and new disciplines and new thoughts about things. And for him to go through, and he was looking at, he wasn't seeing he was seeing pretty colors, like his men who were untrained and all that. They were seeing pretty colors as you do. It's incredible to see the light strike the Grand Canyon and see all the different hues and the colors. Well, Powell was going, he would see a band thin band of alternating white and kind of darkish color, and in it he would see just over and over and over again. And this was in the inland sea coming in and receding, so dropping this went over eons, but this great inland sea over the continent. And when the sea was over the land, it would drop these microorganisms, sea organisms, and it would form limestone. And then when the water would go out on these beachheads would be then just mud sediments and things like that. And then the sea would come back in. And so he was seeing these, and he was seeing these irregularities and conformities, and he was seeing volcanic events, and he was beginning, and he said this was like reading a book about the nature of Earth's history, and really gave him insights into deep time, which were these ideas that the earth was not just 6,000 years old, the biblical thing that a lot of people ascribe to. It was many millions of years. What do we do with that? What does that mean in terms of how we see, what is the human place on Earth, and it's, like Copernicus and Galileo, and, was beginning to change our very thoughts of, and that really influenced what he would become later as one of America's most prestigious and, influential scientists.
Mm-hmm.